So I'm Vijay. I'm the co-founder CEO of Applied A Consulting.
So now, what to expect from the webinar? What will be a takeaway from this webinar in next 30 minutes that we are going to talk about? So before I'll set the expectation, what it is not. It is not about migrating the data into database. It is another complex subject, and maybe in another webinar we'll handle about that. Also, it is not a sales speech. It is purely an experience of us using the different tools and the POCs that we have done to help uh, do the schema migration from my Microsoft SQL Server to PostgreSQL. So it is just our experience that we are trying to share, and it's a very, very point experience. This is not a big topic that we're trying to talk about, a very point problem, and I'll talk about the use cases and what we are trying to solve. And there'll be a conversion journey that will cover how we really did the conversion from Microsoft SQL Server schema to and store procedures and functions to PostgreSQL. So in next 20-25 minutes, what I and Gigi would talk about, at the end of it, I expect all of us to be aware of what are the different, why should we first migrate? When should we think about even migrating? And see what all can be tried, because we have already tried something, so you can learn from our mistakes and our challenges. And on top of it, you can add your own value. So at the end of 30 minutes, we should be able to plan out any migration activity of this level where you are moving from Microsoft SQL Server to PostgreSQL. So the flow of event would be, I'll talk about a problem and approach solution. What was the problem? Why even did we do this, right? What did the customers, had a problem? How did it articulated it? And then benefits that the customer is getting out of it. And then Gigi would talk about the conversion steps technically, how really we did the conversion, and then what kind of time estimation we should keep in our mind when we are embarking on such projects. And then at the end, you will have close to 10 minutes time to ask any questions or anything that comes to your mind. So those who joined us just now, we just got started. So the flow of event I was talking about. So moving to the story. Our customer is a leading CRM for investment banks. Based out of Singapore, they have multiple investment banks as their customers. And the problem, so they have been using Microsoft SQL Server entirely, Microsoft stack that they had, .NET stack, and they have been using Microsoft SQL Server for the application. So the three top problems when we started talking to them, and we started talking to them for a lot of migration and DevOps work that we are doing with them. So one of the problem that came to us was, number one, the cost. They were paying close to 40K, 50K per year ARR on the MS SQL Server license, plus the other costs that they were paying. Second, the upgrade and maintenance. Though there are tools available by Microsoft SQL Server to help upgrade, but I mean, it still takes time. It's not, a button click, it's not as easy, right? So that was another challenge. And then there was a downtime which they could not afford at this point, right? So, we talked about it, the challenge that they were facing. And C, the application, this leading CRM application is a database-centric application, the way it is designed today. And lot of business logic and core functionalities are part of the database, the stored procedures and functions. So they have close to 360 odd stored procedures, and some of them really complex ones, which are trying to literally be part of some other business logic. And when you have so much of dependency on your stored procedures and functions to decide your business logic and application functionality, then the challenge was that's like any other code. Are we even doing testing of that? Are you even doing code coverage of that? Are you doing unit testing of that, right? Like any other code. And this was a big problem because every change in a database, every change in the schema, every change in the stored procedure costed them a fair amount of quality testing, fair amount of regression and whatnot. So, and very good problem that they covered about it. When we started working with them, and earlier we had also helped customers migrate to AWS or RDB. We had, another customer where we could save, money, and also we talked to the customer about all what we have done, and then the solution that we agreed upon. And I'm using the word agreed upon because there is some work, on the customer side also to make sure that this migration happens, end to end. It's not a button click approach. So the solution we agreed upon is migrate to an open source DB, so that they can save a tangible cost on a license. And will talk about the cost saving in the further slides. Then B, database schema conversion from Microsoft SQL Server to Postgres SQL. That included the tables, triggers, stores, procedures, and functions. All of this. And we'll talk about how we did it. That's the whole purpose of this webinar. And then C, unit testing of the DB code, because there was heavy business logic dependency. So these three became the go-to work for us to help customer achieve cost difference, help with upgrade, and help with better managed, tested stored procedures. So with this background, let me move to the benefits they achieved after this, and then we'll jump onto more technical stuff where Gigi would cover in detail. So they saved close to 35-40K on ARR on the license cost and DB operation costs. So that's a saving they achieved. B, high availability and performance because it's AWS Aurora, hosted in AWS. So inbuilt, availability and performance. C, we could, help with the functional testing and code coverage calculation for the stored procedures and functions that we migrated or converted over time, the 360 order stored procedures I talked about. And we have learned over time, right, that and the experience that we carry from our development world, that the area, the testing should be localized to the area which is getting changed. In this case, the database schema is getting migrated. The stored procedures and functions are getting migrated. So we had to make sure that we are localizing the testing to that. I'm not saying that they don't have to do regression testing. They still have to do a fair bit of functional testing on their application post migration, but that should be a fair bit. It should not be boiling the ocean kind, right? Because we are boiling the ocean at the very granular localized level when we are really migrating the schema from Microsoft SQL Server to PostgreSQL. That's where we are trying to make sure that our code coverage is 100% of all the code that we are migrating, which is stored procedure and functions. So that we could make sure that that is done. So we could achieve close to 95 to 98% code coverage out there. Then ability to reduce backend load by processing results at DB level. This is super important from customer perspective. You may encounter this in your applications or not, but in this case, it was super important because the existing, the stored procedures and function they had in Microsoft SQL Server had to give a specific output, and then there was a layer which was transforming that for each application input that required, the modules that required. Now that, so they had to, depend upon an interpreter in between to interpret the result of the stored procedures and functions for the applications. Now, when we move to PostgreSQL, there are inbuilt functionalities function which helps us, produce a result in a specific format, and so the application could consume that directly. and that avoided another layer, avoided another piece of code, or avoided another piece of redundancy and failures, right? So this is something that helped them with performance, which helped them also with maintainability and other aspects. And lastly, I mean, unsaid, being in open source, PostgreSQL is growing. I'm sure that's happening with MicroSQL Server also. So they get the benefit of it. Overall, from a cost perspective, they could save 5,000, 7,000 per year cost on license to $0, and operational cost also say they saved close to 70-75% of operational cost over the year. So this is this is a kind of graph that represents the same. So with this, let me change gears and move this to Gigi. Gigi, if you can talk about how did we embark on the conversion journey. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Vijay. Yeah, I think that background helps a lot. And yeah, let's get into the details of it. I think many of us are possibly wanting to look at what did or how did we do, and what are the tools that we used, and what are some of the challenges that we faced, and why we faced. And while I'm talking through it, if you yourself have gone through it and you have some better good experiences that you want to share in terms of tool, please do not hesitate. Write it in the chat, and I will love to hear that. Okay, so it started with an engagement. I mean, existing customers. So it started with an engagement where we had to do a quick POC because of the requirement. Right? One of the important one being uh, the DB, the bottommost layer. If any issues or if any bugs in terms of after conversion or after migration of the schema, then it is going to have a ripple effect in the application. So that's why the code coverage, and that's where a lot of focus went in terms of identifying the tool which can give us the code coverage for the store procedures and functions that are getting converted and are getting migrated. Right, that's one important piece. Second was the tool to use for the schema migration. And yes, we are AWS shop, so there was a good amount of focus in terms of using AWS. We also looked at some of the other tools which allows or which converts the schema or migrates the schema. But we zeroed on to AWS. It gave us good amount of accuracy. I'll get into the level of accuracies in different areas. There was some manual work which we saw that every other tool which we looked at for schema migration has some or other manual work in terms of the data types, or in terms of looking at the logic and validating the logic and functionality and those things. So that's the second important piece that we had to spend time on after identifying and doing some POCs around the code coverage and unit test things. And once that was done, then it was all, I mean, converted schema in a form of the code, which was used in the development pipelines to deploy and manage the DBs, um, as the application had it today in terms of deploying and installing the DB changes. Okay. So yeah, moving to the next one here. And I think this is the place where possibly they might be interested in terms of some of the tools. Um, like I said, the DB schema conversion tool was AWS schema conversion tool, or SCT, that we use. It gave us good accuracy in terms of 60 to 70% for simple and small procedures. They were not, those were simple, not very complex procedures. There were some work like 30 to 40% of work, manual work, was still required post conversion. Why? Because of some logic checks or some entity checks had to be done. Even the parameter names had to be changed manually. So some small work there, but we were able to pick a lot of them, get it converted, get into the hands of the developer, get those done quickly. So we were moving in phases, right? Get the conversion done for selected few. We were looking at around 350 to 400 different store procedures for this customer. So pick the ones identified as simple and small one, get them converted, focus effort on getting those manually fixed, write the unit test for them, get them in the pipeline in terms of making sure that the coverage for all of those converted is in there, right? So we work like that. Even some small things like a simplistic begin and end block is a begin and end block in MS SQL, but when it comes to Postgre, the transaction control is there, so we had to validate for that it is in the right place and it's not violating anything, or some inbuilt functions like UUID generator, date time, or some of the other things, right, were different, and we had to do it manually to now adhere or to work with the converted or the changed DB. We did face among those 350, 360 plus procedures, we did face few which were complex enough where, apart from some of the work that I mentioned, uh, we had to put in a good amount of time to look at the queries because they were complex, multiple table, but different type of join queries, and they were working differently in MSSQL versus Postgres. So we had to play with that code and change that logic, along with the input data getting passed to the procedure being XML data and being different type of data at times had to be extracted and then manually changed when converted to Postgres. So that's why the accuracy that we got in complex procedures like those was not more than 20-30%, and good amount of effort went there. So that's why we blocked it like that. We phased it like that. Pick up simple ones, pick up complex ones, get them done. But much before that, we looked at the table conversions. Table conversions were fairly highly accurate, close to 100%. Only thing that I think we faced was once we realized some of these changes, we were able to write some rules within the ACT in terms of like the data type. I mean, bit to boolean into different databases and some of the other standards in terms of naming and all. Once we did that, we got a fairly good accuracy in terms of table transforms or table conversions. Yeah. So before I talk about unit test, let me spend a minute or so on UT coverage. Like we talked earlier, coverage was one of the important thing for this customer. We landed on a tool called as Pigly as well as PGTab. One important point which helped us make a decision to use Pigly was it allowed you to write the unit test in whatever form you want, because it was based on a design and an architecture that it was instrumenting the end code or the store procedure or functions code in such a way that then it was only playing with the DB. It does not matter what type of unit testing framework or language or programming thing that you're using. So it worked very well. We had a familiarity of PyTest across our team, being following it for long, for all of our serverless development, which are Python-based development for us. So it was an easy choice. We faced a problem where the newer versions of Postgre now has a native support for store procedures. Earlier, functions were used as store procedures in Postgre, but Pigly is not being worked on. Being open source, not being worked on. It's not as active as other open sources, not being worked on, and so it is not supporting the native store procedures. But function it does supports, and for this customer, we're okay to use functions. So that's why it went fine. But there was one challenge, one problem that we faced, and PGTab, the whole way of writing tests and all was a different learning. So it was an easy choice for us to go with Pigly and write the unit test in PyTest. So those were the tools primarily, nothing different. I mean, underlying pipelines, containers, and all were part of it. But the core piece of the tools that were used were those that helped us get this done easily, quickly for this customer. Like I said, some of the challenges, coverage was an important one. So identifying the tool, we had to go back and forth, work with the customer, show the demos, show the recordings to make sure there's an engagement and there's an because finally customer had to retain it, use it, right? So there was a good amount of engagement. Customer was a good DB expertise himself, right? So that's why picking a right tool there was important. The challenge of Pigly not supporting the native store procedure in Postgre became a challenge, but we are hoping that we ourselves or maybe somebody in the open source world can put up a PR for supporting the native store procedures in Pigly. It shouldn't be a big deal. It's a Ruby-based tool, so should be easily done. Maybe we yourself will do it in near future. The DB heavy logic So think of this, we guys did not know the core functionalities of the product, right? So we had to look at this DB heavy logic, make sure we understand it, and make sure we look at it and make sure we validate it, right? So that we are able to write good functional test cases for that, for the converted functions and purposes. So that became a challenge because of unfamiliarity, but we faced it and we worked around it and worked closely with the customer to make it happen. Okay, so I mean, what is the, so I don't know, I mean, we thought that it might help to figure out how long it might take, based on which the decision of when to look for such conversion, such migration would be right time. Uh, there is no one answer to it. Right? I mean, the simplistic answer, it depends, which nobody likes, but depending on the complexity of the databases that you're using, if you are not database heavy in terms of having the compute close to the database because of the architectural decisions that you want to make, like this customer, then their databases are having, I mean, may not have such logic or core logic close to the database in terms of triggers and store procedures. Become simple. Even the conversion tool will give you really high value, and you'll be able to convert really quickly within maybe a month or even less than that. I mean, overall testing and all will take some time, but that's what it would be. But when it comes to complex uh, processing and logic close to the data within the database, using the core database constructs like store procedure functions and others, then the complexity increases, and so the time taken to conversion surely will increase, like it did for us. Uh, and based on that, you may have to make a decision in terms of when to look for. I mean, for this customer, it was the right time based on the estimate. Their license expiry was coming in 3 to 4 months, and that's where they were able to make a decision that we want to start now and make it happen, so that we don't have to worry about renewing the license in the next cycle. So that's what one simple thing that came out as a takeaway for us.
Good. Thank you, Gigi. So that brings us to the end of the discussion. Now we should go through the questions that I see in the chat. There are a couple of questions. If you can, Gigi, open the chat and read out the questions and maybe help answer.
Okay, yeah, I think the first one was comparative cost. I think you answered it. It's in the slide. You would even possibly share the recording later, so we can go through it. It's a fair comparison. Again, it's a approximate comparison. Depends on various things in terms of the instances, the cluster that you want to set, the various environments that you want to put, right? Serverless angle to Aurora versus not there, depending on the environment that you're using. You would possibly use serverless DB for your non-production thing, right? So such things will help you even reduce the cost further. So those things will play in. So another question from Rakesh was, Vijay mentioned that you use some inbuilt functions in Postgre. How did you have to change the store procedure to use the available functions, right? Yeah, so some functions, the way they were used in terms of package and function name and parameters were different, right? As simple as getting now, the function name and the way it is used is different in MSSQL versus Postgre. So we had to, whenever we face this, we had to look at it and convert it correctly. That was one thing that we worked over, and we made those changes.
Thanks, Gigi. So are there any other questions that are coming up, anyone?
Feel free to ask, or even if you don't, I mean, even if some other questions comes later point of time in your mind, post a message on LinkedIn or drop a mail. I think we mentioned the mail ID there. The intent is for us to be able to share it and see if it helps anyone. As well, learn if you guys have done things and done it differently, then I would really love to know and learn and use those. Cool. I think we are at the end. Thanks a lot again. It was good to have you guys spend time. Time is the most valuable thing. So you spending 30 minutes with us is I mean, I'm happy to have you here, and happy to hear any questions as well as any experiences that you have. Thanks a lot, guys. Have a good one.
Thanks, Yuji. Thanks everyone for joining in. We'll share the recording with you and happy to hear your feedback. Thank you very much.